There is a moment in almost every leader's career that nobody warns them about. And it's not the first time you have a difficult conversation with a direct report. Nope. It's not the first time someone on your team underperforms. Nope. It's not even the first time you realize that managing people is harder than you thought it would be. No. It's the moment you realize that managing people and developing people are two completely different jobs. And that everything you were promoted for, your technical expertise, your execution skills, your ability to deliver results, prepared you for the first job and not the second one. Most leaders figure this out the hard way. They step into a leadership role, they bring the same skills that made them exceptional as individual contributors, and they manage their team the way they manage their own work, efficiently, precisely, with high standards and clear expectations. And their team gets things done, but it doesn't grow. The same people keep doing the same work at the same level. Nobody is developing. Nobody is being stretched. And the leader who is excellent at execution is actually becoming the ceiling of her own team's potential. That is exactly where my client Angela was when she stepped into the Interim General Counsel role. She had spent 14 months preparing herself for the next level. She had built her strategic capabilities, her visibility, her presence. She had done the internal work that most professionals never do. And then she walked into her first week as Interim General Counsel, responsible for a team of 4 people who'd been led by someone else for years, and realized something uncomfortable. She knew how to be an excellent lawyer. She knew how to lead herself. She had never learned how to develop someone else. Today, we're talking about that shift, what it looks like, what it requires, and the framework Angela and I built together, what I call the talent architecture that changed how she thought about her team, her role, and what leadership at the GC level actually means. This is session 3, and it starts with a question Angela had to answer about every person on her team. Am I managing this person or am I developing them? I'm Christina Holloway, and for over 25 years, I've coached senior leaders at organizations like Google, GE, and Spotify to architect their authority and navigate the high-stakes politics of the Fortune 500. On this channel, I show you how to recognize the power plays hiding in plain sight and how to communicate with the presence that demands a seat at the table. And here's what I know. The hardest leadership transition most professionals make isn't into management, it's into development. Managing is about getting work done. Developing is about building the people who do it. And very few leaders are ever explicitly taught the difference. That's what we're doing today. We're in session 3 of Angela's coaching engagement, 14 months, 1 goal. And if you're just joining us, Angela is an assistant general counsel who spent 14 months preparing to become the next general counsel at her firm. Session 1 and 2 were about developing herself. Today is about something harder, developing everyone else. All right, so let's get started. While Angela continued to develop into the interim GC role, she began to realize that her next move would not only impact her, it would impact her new team as well, one that her boss had built. 4 people who'd been led by her boss for years, who had his rhythms and his expectations and his way of doing things, who had built their working relationships around a leader who was leaving and who were now being asked to recalibrate around someone they had known until very recently as a peer. That last part mattered more than Angela had anticipated. Let me introduce you to her team. I've changed all their names. Marcus was a senior attorney with 8 years at the firm, technically excellent, reliable. He could be trusted to handle complex matters independently. He was also the person who had expected to be considered for the interim role himself. He hadn't been, and Angela knew it. Priya was a mid-level attorney 4 years into her career at the firm, sharp, ambitious, and genuinely exceptional at her work. She reminded Angela of herself at that stage, someone who was excellent at execution and completely unaware that execution alone wasn't going to get her where she wanted to go. Angela recognized the pattern immediately. Derek was a junior attorney 18 months in, still developing, made mistakes, asked good questions, showed the kind of curiosity that Angela had learned to value more than polish, because curiosity was coachable in a way that complacency wasn't. And then there was Sandra, the legal operations manager. Not an attorney, but the institutional memory of the entire department. She had worked alongside Angela's boss for 12 years. She knew where everything was, the files, the relationships, the unwritten protocols, the history, behind decisions that looked arbitrary on the surface. She was not going to be won over quickly, and Angela knew that too. 4 people, 4 completely different relationships to Angela's new authority, 4 completely different development needs. And Angela's instinct, organized and task-driven, was to assess what each person was doing and figure out how to make the department run more efficiently. That was the wrong instinct. And to her credit, Angela recognized it almost immediately. She came to our session at the end of her first week as interim GC, and she said, "I spent the whole week trying to figure out what everyone was working on, and by Friday, I realized I didn't know what any of them were good at." That distinction between knowing what someone is working on and knowing what they're good at is the difference between managing and developing. It was the gap Angela needed to close before she could build the team her new GC role required her to lead. Because here's what I've learned after 25 years of working with leaders at every level. A team doesn't become high performing because its leader manages it well. It becomes high performing because its leader knows over time where each person's strengths do the most strategic work. That's what the talent architecture is about, not organizing tasks, not improving efficiency, building a team where the right people are doing the right work for the right reasons and growing in the process. But before Angela could build that architecture, she had to do something else first. She had to stop looking at her team's output and start looking at her team. The first thing Angela and I did in our next session was build a map, not of the work, of the people. I asked her 4 questions about each member of her team. These were development questions that went beyond performance and output. What does this person do better than almost anyone else in this department? What kind of work energizes them versus drains them? What is the gap between where they are now and where they're capable of going? And what would it take specifically to close that gap? Angela could answer the first question for all 4 people fairly quickly. She had worked alongside them long enough to know their technical capabilities. But the second, third, and fourth questions tripped her up. Nobody had ever asked her to think about her team that way. Her boss had managed by output. Angela had been managed by output. And output-focused management done consistently over time produces exactly the kind of team Angela inherited. Competent, reliable, and completely underdeveloped. That's where the talent architecture begins, with a clear-eyed assessment of where each person's strengths are and a deliberate plan for putting those strengths to work at the highest possible level. Anybody who leads at any level can and should use this framework. Here's how the framework works. The A level, strategic strengths. These are the capabilities on your team that are already operating at or near the next level. The thinking that goes beyond the job description, the judgment that doesn't need supervision, the work that, if given more room and more visibility, would elevate the entire team's output. For Angela, that was Priya. Priya was technically excellent and strategically underdeveloped, which meant her A-level strength wasn't fully developed yet. She was doing B-level work, not because she was a B-level performer, but because nobody had ever asked her to do anything else. She had been executing brilliantly inside a lane that was far too narrow for her. Angela's job with Priya wasn't to manage her current performance. It was to architect her next level, to give her the stretch assignments, the strategic visibility, and the development conversations that Angela had spent 14 months fighting to create for herself. To do for Priya, deliberately and early, what nobody had done for Angela until it was almost too late. A succession plan. That conversation, Angela sitting down with Priya and saying, "I see where you're going and I'm going to help you get there," is one of the most important things Angela did in her entire 14-month engagement with me. Not because it was strategically necessary, because it was the moment she became a leader rather than a manager. The B level, core strengths. These are the capabilities that keep the team running. The steady, reliable, high-quality work that doesn't make headlines, but makes everything else possible. The people in this zone are your department's foundation, and they need 2 things from their leader. Consistent recognition of the value they're providing and deliberate development toward the next level when they're ready for it. For Angela, that was Marcus. Marcus was the most complex relationship on the team. He was an A-level performer in many respects, technically exceptional, deeply experienced, genuinely valuable. But he was also carrying the weight of an unspoken expectation that hadn't been met. He had wanted the interim role. He hadn't gotten it. And that dynamic, if Angela left it unaddressed, was going to quietly undermine everything she was trying to build. So she addressed it directly. She didn't apologize for the decision. She didn't over-explain it. She sat down with Marcus in her second week and said something that required real leadership maturity to say. I know this transition wasn't what you expected. I also know that what you bring to this team is irreplaceable, and I want to talk about what the next chapter looks like for you. I want to make sure that what I'm building here creates real opportunity for your growth, not just continuity of the work you've already done. Really important. Marcus didn't respond immediately, but he showed up differently the following week and the week after that. That's what B-level development looks like, not managing someone's output, honoring their contribution while opening doors they didn't know were still available to them. The C-level, emerging strengths. These are the capabilities that are still forming, the potential that hasn't fully surfaced yet. The people in this zone need the most deliberate investment, not because they're the weakest link, but because they're the most developable asset on the team if their leader is willing to coach rather than correct. For Angela, that was Derek. Derek made mistakes. That wasn't the problem. The problem Angela had to resist was her instinct to fix the mistakes herself, to step in, redo the work, and move on. Because that instinct, however efficient it felt in the moment, was exactly the pattern her own boss had fallen into with her. And it produced exactly the same result. A capable person who never fully developed because their leader was always in the way. Instead, Angela built what I call a coaching loop with Derek. When he made a mistake, she didn't correct it immediately. She asked him a question first. Walk me through your thinking on this. Sometimes his thinking was sound and a mistake was execution. Sometimes his thinking revealed a gap that needed a conversation rather than a correction. And occasionally his thinking surprised her, showed her an angle she hadn't considered, and she told him so. That part mattered enormously because the moment a developing professional realizes their leader genuinely values their perspective, not just their output, something shifts. They stop performing for approval and start thinking for contribution. And that shift is what turns a C-level emerging talent into a B-level solid contributor faster than any amount of correction ever could. And then there was Sandra. Sandra didn't fit neatly into any of the three levels because Sandra's value wasn't primarily about development. It was about continuity. 12 years of institutional knowledge, 12 years of knowing how the department actually worked versus how it was supposed to work. 12 years of relationships with every administrative function in the organization. Angela's instinct, like most new leaders coming into an established team, was to demonstrate her authority by making changes, to signal that things were going to be different now, to establish herself as the one in charge. That would have been a catastrophic mistake. Instead, Angela spent her first month with Sandra listening, asking questions, learning the history behind decisions that had looked arbitrary to her as a peer, understanding the informal systems Sandra had built that kept the department running smoothly and that existed nowhere in any documented process. And then she did something that Sandra told her later she had never experienced from a leader before. She gave Sandra credit for what she knew. And not privately either, in a team meeting, in front of Marcus and Priya and Derek. Sandra has 12 years of knowledge about how this department operates. I have 14 months of preparation for the role I'm stepping into. We're going to need both of those things to make this transition work, and I want everyone in this room to know that Sandra's institutional knowledge is one of this team's most valuable assets. Sandra became Angela's most committed ally within 30 days. That is the talent architecture in practice, a deliberate, human, strategically intelligent approach to understanding where each person's strengths live and building a team environment where those strengths do the most important work. Because here's what Angela understood by the end of her first month as interim GC. Her job was no longer to be the best lawyer in the room. Her job was to build the room where everyone else could become their best. By month 12, Angela had a functioning team. They were not perfect, but they were a team that was moving, each person developing in a direction that made sense for their strengths, their ambitions, and the work the department needed to do at the highest level. And Angela came to our session that month with a question that told me we were exactly where we needed to be. How do I stop being the answer to every question? And that question, that specific frustration, is the signal I wait for with every leader I work with at this stage, because it means the talent architecture is working. The team is developing, the people are bringing their thinking, their initiative, their emerging capabilities to the work. And the leader who built all of that deliberately is now the bottleneck she never intended to become. It's a good problem, but it's still a problem. Here's what was happening. Angela had spent her first month learning her team, her second and third months building the development architecture around each person, and somewhere in that process, she had become the person everyone brought their most important questions to. Communication had opened up. Angela was genuinely excellent at her old job, and her team knew it, and defaulting to her judgment felt safer than trusting their own. That dynamic. A high-performing leader who has built a capable team that still defers to her is one of the most common traps at the senior level, and it has a specific cause. The leader hasn't yet made the transition from being the source of the answers to being the architect of the environment where answers get found. That's big. That is the final shift, and it's the hardest one because it requires something that doesn't come naturally to people who've built their careers on being excellent. It requires the leader to deliberately create space where she's not the most capable person in the room, or at least where she stops acting like it. So we worked on 3 things. The first was the strategic question habit. Angela had been answering questions, and we changed that. When a team member came to her with a problem, a legal question, a process decision, a judgment call, her default response shifted from an answer to a question. What do you think the right approach is? As a genuine invitation to develop the thinking of the person in front of her. Because every time Angela answered a question she could have redirected, she was, without intending to, communicating that her judgment was more reliable than theirs. And that communication, repeated over time, was the exact dynamic that had kept Angela herself from developing the strategic confidence the GC role required. She was doing to her team what had been done to her, and she stopped. The adjustment took about 3 weeks before it felt natural. Marcus pushed back initially. He was used to getting direct answers and found the redirection slightly frustrating. Priya thrived immediately. She had been waiting for someone to take her thinking seriously. Derek grew visibly in confidence within the first month, and Sandra, who had spent 12 years being the person others came to for answers, recognized exactly what Angela was doing and told her so. You're doing what he never did. You're actually asking us. The second was the direct conversation. Angela had been so focused on developing her team individually that she had not yet done something the GC role specifically required her to do. She had not told them where they were going. What hadn't existed was Angela's vision for the team itself, for what she wanted them to become, for the kind of legal function she was building and the role each of them would play in it. So at month 12, she held a team meeting unlike any the department had ever had. She didn't bring an agenda. She brought a question. If this legal team is exceptional 2 years from now, not just competent, genuinely exceptional, what does that look like? And what does each of you need to develop to be part of that? Visionary. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. It surfaced things Angela hadn't known, ambitions Marcus had never voiced, a direction Priya was considering that Angela could directly support, a process inefficiency Derek had identified that nobody had ever asked him about, and a relationship Sandra had built with outside counsel that was far more valuable than anyone had realized. Angela walked out of that meeting with more strategic intelligence about her team than she had gathered in the previous 3 months of one-on-ones. And her team walked out with something they had never had under the previous general counsel, a leader who had asked them what they wanted to become. The third was the deliberate letting go. This was the hardest, and it was the one Angela had to practice rather than learn. There's a specific kind of discomfort that high-performing leaders feel when they watch someone on their team do something in a way that they wouldn't have done it. Not wrong exactly, just different, less precise than they would have been, less polished, taking a slightly longer route to the right answer. Every instinct says, step in, fix it, show them how it should be done. And Angela had that instinct constantly with Derek, especially with Marcus occasionally, even with Priya, whose thinking was excellent, but whose execution sometimes made Angela's perfectionist training want to intervene. She resisted, not perfectly, but consistently enough that her team started to trust that they had room to develop without being corrected at every turn. And something happened as a result. that Angela described at our final session in a way I want to share with you directly because it captures something I've seen happen with every leader who makes this transition successfully. She said, I used to measure my value by what I personally delivered. Now I measure it by what my team is capable of. And my team is capable of things I never would have predicted when I walked in as interim GC 14 months ago. That's the shift from managing to developing, from measuring your leadership by your own output to measuring it by the growth of the people around you, from being the answer to being the architect of an environment where answers get found, developed, tested, and owned by the people who will carry the work forward after you. That's a legacy. Angela's team didn't become exceptional because she was excellent. It became exceptional because she chose, deliberately, consistently, over 14 months, to make their development as important as her own. And 1 month later, she was named general counsel. Not because she was the best lawyer in the building, we've established that, but because she had built the team that proved she was ready to lead it. I want to leave you with something before we wrap up today. When Angela stepped into that interim GC role, she had every technical qualification the position required. She had the legal expertise, she had the institutional knowledge, she had 14 months of deliberate preparation behind her. What she didn't have yet was the one thing that would ultimately define her as a general counsel rather than a very good lawyer in a general counsel's chair. She hadn't learned to lead through other people. That shift from measuring your value by what you personally deliver to measuring it by what the people around you become is the hardest transition in leadership because it requires a fundamentally different relationship with your own identity as a professional. You have spent years building your expertise, your judgment, your reputation. Those things are real and they matter. But at some point, and for most high performers, that point comes sooner than they expect. The ceiling of your career stops being determined by how good you are. It starts being determined by how good you make everyone else. That's what the talent architecture is about, not a delegation system and not a task management tool, a deliberate philosophy for building the conditions where the people around you develop into the best version of what they're capable of becoming. And here's what I want you to take from today. Before the next team meeting, before the next one-on-one, before the next time someone on your team comes to you with a question you could easily answer yourself, ask yourself what Angela finally learned to ask. Am I managing this person or am I developing them? Because those are two different jobs. And only one of them builds something that lasts beyond you. Next week is session 4, the final session in Angela's engagement, and it's the one I've been looking forward to sharing with you the most because session 4 is about the moment everything Angela built became visible to the people who are deciding her future. It's about executive presence across distance, how to make sure your impact is seen, felt, and attributed to you in a hybrid world where the old rules of visibility no longer apply. If you've been watching this series from the beginning, thank you. Angela's story is almost complete and the ending is worth staying for. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss session 4. And if today's video resonated, if you recognized yourself in Angela's team, or if you're leading a team right now and felt the gap between managing and developing, I want to hear about it in the comments. Tell me which team member reminded you most of someone you're leading right now, because your experience matters here, and more often than you might think, naming it out loud is the first step to changing it. My free communication toolkit is linked in the description below. It includes the frameworks we've referenced throughout this series so you can start applying them before your next leadership conversation. I'm Christina Holloway. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in session 4. Bye.